I said, "Bring another round or get me your manager," Brandon slurred, his words thick with alcohol and frustration. The young waiter, barely older than Brandon himself, shifted uncomfortably on his feet. His black apron was already damp with spilled drinks from the busy Friday night crowd. "Sir, I brought the bill for the previous drinks. When you switched tables, I had to start a new order for—" Brandon cut him off with a dismissive wave of his hand, nearly knocking over an empty shot glass in the process. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself against the booth's worn leather seat. The room seemed to tilt slightly, but he fought to maintain his composure. "Listen, just bring me another round of tequilas and please don't make me lose it." The waiter glanced nervously toward the bar where his manager was serving other customers. "Sir, one moment please. Let me get the manager." Brandon watched him hurry away, weaving through the crowded floor of Murphy's Bar, a popular college hangout known for its cheap drinks and dim lighting. The 22-year-old college dropout leaned back against the sticky booth, his vision slightly blurred as he surveyed the scene around him. Tonight was supposed to be perfect. He had already passed his usual drinking limit, but the night was still young, and more importantly, Alex was here. The bass from the sound system thumped through his chest as loud music filled the space, creating a wall of sound that made conversation difficult. On the small dance floor near the back, silhouettes moved rhythmically under the strobing lights. The girls from his group were out there somewhere, dancing without him, their laughter occasionally cutting through the music. Brandon had been trying all evening to impress them, particularly hoping to win Alex's heart. She was everything he thought he wanted, confident, beautiful, and just out of reach enough to make the chase exciting. Brandon squinted through the haze of cigarette smoke and tried to spot Alex among the dancers. There she was, her auburn hair catching the coloured lights as she moved with an easy grace that made his pulse quicken. She wore a black dress that hugged her curves perfectly, and every guy in the place seemed to notice. That was exactly why Brandon needed to step up his game tonight. Feeling a surge of liquid courage, Brandon pushed himself up from the booth and struggled to keep steady while trying to join the dancers. His legs felt like rubber, and the floor seemed to shift beneath his feet with each step. The other patrons gave him sideways glances as he stumbled forward, one hand pressed against the wall for support. His first attempt at dancing resulted in him bumping into a couple, earning him an annoyed glare from the boyfriend. "Sorry, man," Brandon mumbled, but his apology was lost in the music. He tried again, this time managing a few awkward movements that bore little resemblance to dancing. A group of girls nearby giggled, but not in the way he had hoped. After a few more failed attempts that left him sweating and dizzy, Brandon gave up and slumped back onto the sofa, his pride as bruised as his ego. The leather cushions seemed to swallow him as he sank deeper, his head spinning from the combination of alcohol and embarrassment. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to regain his composure. 10 minutes later, just as Brandon was beginning to drift off, the waiter returned with a tray of fresh tequilas, their golden contents gleaming under the bar lights. The manager followed closely behind, a stern-looking man in his 40s with greying temples and the weathered expression of someone who had dealt with countless drunk college students over the years. Seeing that Brandon was nearly asleep, his head lolling to one side and his breathing heavy, the manager quickly grabbed the waiter's hand and stopped him from setting down the drinks. "I think he's had enough," the manager said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of experience. He had seen this scenario play out too many times, young men drinking beyond their limits, trying to impress someone, and ending up either in a fight or face down on his floor. The waiter nodded gratefully, understanding that his boss had just saved him from a potentially messy situation. They retreated toward the bar, leaving Brandon to his alcohol-induced stupor. A few moments later, the girls returned to their seats, slightly out of breath and glowing with perspiration from dancing. Their cheeks were flushed, and they were still riding the high of the music and movement. When they saw Brandon almost passed out in the corner of the booth, they burst into laughter. "Oh my God, look at him!" Tiffany whispered to the others, her voice filled with amusement rather than concern. Alex, the girl Brandon had been trying so desperately to impress all evening, approached him with a mischievous grin. She was still breathless from dancing, her hair slightly messed, but somehow looking even more attractive. "Hey, Brandon," she said, her voice carrying a teasing tone that cut through his haze. "I thought you said you could last longer than that. How are you planning on impressing me?" She giggled as she nudged his shoulder, trying to wake him up. Her touch sent an electric shock through his system, and Brandon's eyes fluttered open. For a moment he was disoriented, unsure where he was or how much time had passed. Groggy but determined not to look weak in front of Alex, Brandon sat up abruptly, causing his head to spin even more violently. Fighting through the disorientation, he shouted with false bravado, "Another round for us!" His words came out louder than intended, drawing attention from nearby tables. The girls burst out laughing again, but this time Brandon couldn't tell if they were laughing with him or at him. The distinction seemed important, though his alcohol-clouded mind couldn't quite grasp why. Apart from the security guards stationed near the entrance and the busy staff weaving between tables, one other person didn't quite belong in the chaotic atmosphere of Murphy's bar: Mrs. Jennifer Callahan. She had been sitting in the same spot for over 2 hours, nursing a single glass of orange juice that had long since lost its chill. Jennifer occupied a small table in the corner, positioned strategically to have a clear view of most of the bar while remaining relatively inconspicuous. Her simple navy blouse and sensible shoes stood in stark contrast to the revealing outfits and high heels worn by most of the female patrons. At 45, she was easily 2 decades older than most of the crowd, and her presence seemed as out of place as a librarian at a rock concert. When the busy waitress had initially approached her table, Jennifer had politely declined anything stronger than orange juice. "That will suffice," she had said with a gentle smile, pressing a generous tip into the girl's hand to ensure she wouldn't be bothered again. Among the mostly younger visitors, Jennifer drew curious glances and whispered comments. As she sat quietly observing, a group of clearly intoxicated college students stumbled past her table, their conversation loud enough to be heard over the music. When one of the guys, who had obviously had far too much to drink, spotted Jennifer sitting alone, he stopped abruptly and stared. His bloodshot eyes took in her appearance with unconcealed surprise. Turning to face his friends with an exaggerated gesture, he mumbled loudly, "Whose mom is that? Shouldn't she be at home tending to her grandkids or something?" His friends laughed and pulled him away before he could say anything else, but the damage was done. Jennifer hadn't heard the specific words over the music, but she caught the mocking tone and the gestures. She had expected this kind of reaction. It wasn't the first time she had felt like an outsider, and it wouldn't be the last. The bartender, a guy in his early 30s with sleeve tattoos and a knowing expression, had heard the entire exchange. He smirked at the group of boys and made a show of wiping down the counter after they left, his disapproval evident in his movements. Once they were gone, he approached Jennifer's table, carrying a fresh glass of orange juice. "Excuse me, Mom," he said, setting down the drink and taking the empty glass. "I don't mean to bother you, and it's none of my business, but I get the feeling you're not here for fun." For the first time that evening, Jennifer looked up from her constant surveillance and smiled. She appreciated the bartender's attentiveness and the kindness in his voice. It was a welcome change from the indifferent or mocking treatment she had received from others. "You're very perceptive," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and resignation. "You're right. I'm not here to enjoy myself. Although, if not for the loud music, I could see myself coming to a place like this sometimes. The atmosphere isn't entirely unpleasant." She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully before continuing. "I know I'll sound like an overprotective mother, but I'm here to watch over my son. He's all I have left in this world, and I don't want him getting into trouble." Jennifer nodded discreetly toward the table where Brandon and the girls were sitting. Even from this distance, it was clear that her son was heavily intoxicated and becoming increasingly unpredictable. The bartender followed her gaze and immediately understood the situation. "That's incredibly thoughtful of you, Mom. Not many mothers would go to such lengths." "I know it seems excessive," Jennifer admitted, her fingers absently turning her wedding ring, a habit she had developed during times of stress. "But he's spiraling out of control, and I'm terrified he might get into a fight and get seriously hurt. Or worse, hurt someone else." The bartender nodded sympathetically. He had seen his share of family drama played out in bars, and he recognized the pain in this mother's eyes. "Would you like me to keep an eye on him too? Sometimes it helps to have someone on the inside." Jennifer's smile was genuine this time. "That would be wonderful. Thank you." As they spoke, Brandon was making his way back from the bathroom, having splashed cold water on his face in an attempt to sober up. The harsh fluorescent lights had been unforgiving, showing him his bloodshot eyes and pale complexion. He looked worse than he felt, which was saying something. When he returned to the table, he felt slightly refreshed, but still unsteady. The cold water had provided only temporary relief from his intoxication. Trying to project an air of confidence he didn't feel, he addressed the group of girls who were now reapplying their makeup and checking their phones. "Let's go," he announced with forced enthusiasm. "We're going to a nightclub. There's a new place downtown. Pulse. It's supposed to be amazing. Come on, let's hurry up." Brandon bent down to grab his phone and car keys from the glass table, his movements still uncoordinated. The keys jingled as his hand shook slightly, a detail that didn't escape the notice of the girls watching him. Tiffany, who despite the evening's drinking still seemed to retain some common sense, spoke up immediately. "I don't mind going to the nightclub, Brandon, but we absolutely need to call a taxi. I'm not getting in your car tonight. I'm sorry, but I just can't." Her words hit Brandon like a slap in the face. He resented what Tiffany had said, taking it as a direct challenge to his masculinity and capabilities. "You think I can't drive?" he asked, his voice rising with indignation. "If you're scared, then go ahead and take a taxi." "I'm driving my own car." The tension at the table was palpable, and the other girls exchanged worried glances. They could see that Brandon was in no condition to drive, but they also knew how stubborn he could be when his pride was challenged. At that moment, a familiar voice came from behind him, cutting through the music and conversation like a knife through silence. "Brandon, honey, please take a taxi." The voice belonged to Jennifer, who had finally decided she needed to intervene before the situation escalated further. She loved Brandon more than life itself, but she could also be firm when necessary, especially when he was drunk and making dangerous decisions. The confrontation at the bar had reached its breaking point. Brandon's face flushed with a mixture of alcohol and rage as he felt the eyes of Alex and the other girls boring into him. The humiliation of being treated like a child in front of the woman he was trying to impress was more than his fragile ego could handle. Without another word, Brandon stormed out of Murphy's bar, pushing past confused patrons and nearly knocking over a waitress carrying a tray of drinks. The cool night air hit his face like a slap, but it did nothing to clear his head or calm his fury. His car, a sleek black Honda Civic that his mother had given him for his 20th birthday, sat in the parking lot under a flickering streetlight. The gift had been Jennifer's way of encouraging his independence, hoping it would help him find a job and take responsibility for his life. Now it would become the instrument of both their downfalls. Jennifer burst through the bar's entrance moments later, her heart pounding with panic and maternal instinct. She had seen that look in Brandon's eyes before, the dangerous combination of alcohol, wounded pride, and reckless determination that had gotten him into trouble countless times before. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the edge of a cliff. "Brandon, wait!" she called out, her voice barely audible over the distant thump of music from the bar and the sounds of late-night traffic. But her son was already fumbling with his keys, his hands shaking from both intoxication and adrenaline. She saw him get into the car, heard the engine roar to life with an aggressive rev that spoke to his state of mind. Jennifer knew she couldn't physically stop him from starting the engine. He was bigger than her, stronger, and fueled by liquid courage and rage. But she could make a choice that would haunt her for years to come. In a moment of desperate maternal instinct, Jennifer ran around to the passenger side of the car and threw herself into the seat just as Brandon was putting the vehicle in drive. The door slammed shut with a decisive click that seemed to seal both their fates. "Get out!" Brandon screamed, but it was too late. He was already pulling out of the parking lot, tires squealing against the asphalt. Ignoring Jennifer's increasingly frantic pleas, Brandon hit the gas and sped wildly down the highway. The speedometer climbed past 50, then 60, in a 35-mile-per-hour zone. The yellow lines on the road blurred past them like a drunken kaleidoscope. "Everyone has normal moms," Brandon yelled, his voice cracking with years of pent-up resentment and alcohol-fueled anger. "But you're the only freak. You're the only one who follows her son around like some kind of stalker." Jennifer gripped the door handle so tightly her knuckles turned white. The city lights streaked past them in dangerous blurs as Brandon wove erratically between other vehicles. "Brandon, pull over. You're drunk. Please stop. You're going to hit someone." But her words only seemed to fuel his rage further. The young man she had raised, loved, and sacrificed everything for turned to her with eyes that burned with hatred. "Get the hell out! I don't want to see you anymore. I'm tired of seeing your face every time I turn around. I'm sick of you ruining my life." As they swerved dangerously between cars, narrowly missing a taxi and causing other drivers to lean on their horns in panic and anger, Jennifer's thoughts seemed to freeze in time. Her son's words hit her like physical blows, each syllable a knife twisting in her heart. Maybe, she thought with a clarity that surprised her even in this moment of terror, it was time to let him go. Maybe it was time to stop worrying about what would happen to him and let him face the consequences of his own actions. Brandon had turned 23 just a week ago. Surely he was old enough to be responsible for his own choices. Perhaps her constant worry and protection had only enabled his reckless behavior. The thought brought with it a strange sense of peace, even as the car careened through traffic. For just a moment, Jennifer felt the weight of years of single motherhood, of sleepless nights worrying about her son, of sacrificing her own happiness for his well-being, lifting from her shoulders. Just as she was about to ask him calmly to pull over so she could get out and leave him to his own devices, they heard it. A sickening hollow thump that seemed to reverberate through the car's frame and into their very bones. The sound cut through Brandon's drunken rage like a sword through silk. In an instant, the artificial courage provided by alcohol evaporated, leaving behind only cold, sobering terror. Brandon slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt so suddenly that both he and Jennifer were thrown forward against their seatbelts. "Mom?" Brandon's voice was suddenly small, childlike, stripped of all its earlier venom. "I think I hit someone." Jennifer screamed, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her soul, and scrambled out of the car. The scene that greeted her was something from her worst nightmares. An elderly man, probably in his 70s, lay motionless on the ground near the intersection. His grey hair was dishevelled, his worn overcoat spread out around him like dark wings. A small grocery bag lay nearby, its contents, a loaf of bread, some milk, a newspaper, scattered across the asphalt like the remnants of an ordinary life, suddenly shattered. Brandon had clipped him with the car's bumper while attempting a right turn at the intersection. The old man had probably been crossing legally, following the walk signal, never imagining that his evening trip to the corner store would be his last. From his position and the unnatural angle of his limbs, Jennifer could tell with horrible certainty that there wasn't much they could do to help him. With trembling fingers, Jennifer immediately dialed 911. Her voice shook as she gave their location to the dispatcher, reporting the accident in a tone that seemed to come from someone else entirely. "Mom?" Brandon's voice came from behind her, and when she turned, she saw him leaning against the car, his face pale as moonlight. "What are we going to do now?" Jennifer looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw not the angry young man who had been screaming at her moments before, but the frightened child he had always been underneath all his bravado. "We can't do much now," she said quietly. "We wait for the police and we tell them the truth." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. The sound seemed to fill the night air with foreboding, announcing that their lives were about to change in ways neither of them could fully comprehend. As they waited, Brandon looked at his mother with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Mom, can you get me my cigarettes? They should be on the dashboard." Jennifer approached the car in a daze, her mind struggling to process the enormity of what had just happened. She felt disconnected from her body, as if she were watching someone else's life unfold. She sat in the driver's seat and began searching for the pack of cigarettes with mechanical movements. "Where is it?" "I don't see it, Brandon," she called out, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. As she leaned forward to look under the seat and in the glove compartment, fumbling around with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, the police and ambulance arrived in a cacophony of flashing lights and urgent voices. 2 police officers approached the elderly man while paramedics rushed to assess his condition. Jennifer watched from the car as one of the paramedics checked for a pulse, then slowly shook his head. The man was dead. After a brief examination of the scene and the victim, the officers walked toward the car. One of them, a veteran cop with greying temples and tired eyes, stopped in front of Jennifer, who was still sitting in the driver's seat. "She's probably going to be charged with vehicular manslaughter," he said quietly to his partner, assuming Jennifer couldn't hear him. "What do you mean, she?" Jennifer looked toward her son in confusion, but Brandon was already talking to a 3rd officer who had arrived on the scene. What she heard next would replay in her nightmares for years to come. Brandon was calmly, methodically, telling the officer how his mother had been driving wildly despite his attempts to make her stop. He painted a picture of a reckless, possibly intoxicated middle-aged woman who had insisted on driving despite her son's protests. He admitted that he had been behind the wheel initially when they left the bar, but claimed that his mother had ordered him to stop the car and they had switched seats. "It's my car, officer, but like I told you, I kept saying, 'Mom, pay attention and look straight ahead.' I think she didn't even notice the old man because she was driving like a maniac. I tried to grab the wheel, but it was too late." The lies flowed from his mouth with a smoothness that chilled Jennifer to her core. This wasn't a panicked young man making a desperate mistake. This was calculated, deliberate deception. "Brandon, what are you talking about?" Jennifer's voice rose in disbelief, her eyebrows shooting up as she stared at her son. He turned to her then, and for just a moment she saw something flicker across his face. Was it guilt? Regret? But it was quickly replaced by that same sad smile she had seen so many times before when he was caught in a lie as a child. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said softly, but his eyes were already turning back to the officer, ready to continue his fabricated story. In that moment, Jennifer understood with crystal clarity what Brandon was doing. She knew that he was counting on her maternal love, on the fact that she would rather sacrifice herself than see him go to prison. She could tell the officers that her son was lying, that he had been driving the entire time, that he was drunk, and she had only been trying to stop him. She had witnesses at the bar who could testify to Brandon's intoxication. She could fight this. But as she looked at her son, her only child, the person she had devoted her entire adult life to protecting and nurturing, she found that she couldn't bring herself to say the words that would send him to prison. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This was the price of unconditional love. This was what it meant to be a mother who would do anything, sacrifice anything for her child, even when that child was willing to sacrifice her in return. Jennifer sat down heavily on the curb and began to sob, deep, wrenching cries that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. Brandon continued sharing his fabricated version of events with the officers, his voice steady and convincing. She was emotionally and physically exhausted, drained by years of worry and the horror of the night's events. She no longer had the strength to resist or fight back. She let everything go and prepared to accept whatever fate awaited her. When the officers brought her the papers to sign, statements acknowledging her role as the driver, she signed them without reading, without protest, without even looking up. She was taken into custody with the same passive acceptance she might have shown when boarding a bus. "I've never seen someone so calm in a situation like this before, Ma'am," one of the arresting officers said, genuine surprise in his voice. "Thank you for your cooperation. I'm sure the court will take your attitude into account during sentencing." If only he knew, Jennifer thought bitterly, that her calmness came not from acceptance of guilt, but from the complete devastation of realizing that the child she had loved more than her own life was willing to destroy her to save himself. The trial was a nightmare of legal proceedings and media attention. The case of the middle-aged woman who had killed an innocent pedestrian while driving under the influence drew considerable public interest. Jennifer sat through it all in a haze of emotional numbness, barely registering the testimonies and arguments. She didn't even look up when Brandon took the witness stand and testified against his own mother. From the corner of her eye, she could see him sitting straighter, speaking more confidently than she had ever seen him before. He was excited, she realized with a stab of pain that cut through her numbness. He was actually excited that he had avoided potential jail time. The verdict came down like a gavel striking the final nail in her coffin. Jennifer Callahan was sentenced to 7 years in prison for vehicular manslaughter caused by reckless driving. When she heard the words, she felt something inside her break completely. It was as if a fog had descended upon her consciousness, muffling all sound until all she could hear were distant, meaningless voices discussing her fate. She had never felt so empty, so utterly hollow in her entire life. 2 years passed in a blur of grey prison walls and regimented schedules. Brandon hadn't visited his mother even once, not on her birthday, not on holidays, not even to ask how she was doing. Jennifer wasn't expecting him to either. Somewhere during those first dark months in prison, she had made a decision that felt like cutting out part of her own heart. She no longer had a son. At Jennifer's request, her lifelong friend Cindy had sold Jennifer's small trucking dispatch company. The business that Jennifer had built from nothing, working 18-hour days while raising Brandon alone, was liquidated to pay for legal fees and victim compensation. A portion of the money went to the deceased man's family, and the rest was deposited in Jennifer's name at the bank, money she might never live to spend. Cindy was the only person who not only visited Jennifer in prison, but also became increasingly outraged that her friend was still kept in the general population despite her deteriorating physical and mental health. The stress, guilt, and depression were taking their toll, and Jennifer was becoming a shadow of her former self. Jennifer had fallen off the face of the earth in every way that mattered. She didn't care about anything anymore, not the news, not her health, not her future. She spent her first months in prison wondering why she had to go through all of this. What cosmic justice demanded such a sacrifice from a mother who had only wanted to protect her child? At some point during those long, sleepless nights in her cell, she found herself wanting simply to die, to disappear forever and escape the crushing weight of betrayal and loss. After several visits and hours of careful, gentle conversation, Jennifer finally confided in Cindy about what had really happened that night. When Cindy realized that Jennifer had gone to prison to protect the very son who had betrayed her, she was heartbroken. But as she learned more about the twisted dynamics of Brandon and Jennifer's relationship, her heartbreak transformed into something much more powerful: righteous anger. Unbeknownst to Jennifer, who had given up all hope of justice or redemption, a special process was beginning to unfold behind the scenes. Cindy, driven by loyalty and fury at the injustice her friend had suffered, began working tirelessly to bring the case back to light and restore some semblance of justice to a situation that had gone horribly wrong. In a twist of irony that seemed almost too perfect to be real, The same prosecutor who had built the case against Jennifer, Larry Garcia, an ambitious attorney who had used Jennifer's case to advance his own career, was now working as a defense attorney in private practice. Cindy discovered this information during her research and realized that Garcia might be the key to undoing the damage he had once helped create. The wheels of a different kind of justice were beginning to turn. The fluorescent lights in the prison visiting room cast harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor as Jennifer sat at one of the metal tables, her hands folded in her lap. She had grown accustomed to these weekly visits from Cindy, finding them to be the only bright spots in her otherwise monotonous existence. But today felt different. When the guard called her name and mentioned she had 2 visitors, Jennifer felt a flutter of curiosity mixed with apprehension. She entered the visiting room to find Cindy sitting beside a man in an expensive charcoal suit. Someone Jennifer recognized but couldn't quite place in this context. As recognition dawned, her stomach dropped. Larry Garcia sat across from her, his dark eyes filled with something she hadn't expected to see: remorse. "Jennifer," Cindy began, her voice carrying the determined edge that Jennifer remembered from their business days together. "I know this is unexpected, but I need you to listen to what we have to say." Jennifer remained silent, studying Larry's face. The last time she had seen him, he had been standing before a jury, methodically dismantling her life with evidence and testimony that painted her as a reckless, dangerous woman. Now he sat before her in a prison visiting room, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Cindy proceeded to fill her friend in on what had transpired over the past few months, speaking rapidly as if afraid Jennifer might interrupt or shut down emotionally. "Jen, I've got your back, so don't even try to talk me out of this. What happened to you is just wrong, morally, legally, and in every way that matters. I'm going to get you out of here. I don't care if Brandon is your son, it doesn't matter who he is. This just isn't right." Jennifer sighed deeply, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of 2 years of imprisonment and betrayal. She looked at Larry with eyes that had lost much of their former warmth. "Mr. Garcia." "Jennifer," Larry began, his voice softer than she remembered from the courtroom. "It's good to see you again. I know how strange this must seem, but this time, I'm on your side. I've spent months reviewing your case, going through every piece of evidence, every witness statement. I think we can get you out of here." Jennifer's response surprised both visitors with its flatness, its complete lack of hope or enthusiasm. "So what? What happens after that?" Her voice was tinged with a bitter indifference that spoke to the depth of her emotional wounds. "I'll be released, and then what? I've lost everything that ever mattered to me. My company is gone, sold to pay for legal fees and compensation. People I've known for years think I'm a deranged convict who killed an innocent man while driving drunk." She paused, her eyes meeting Larry's directly for the first time. "Am I supposed to go around telling people that I was falsely imprisoned? That my own son should be the one behind bars? Why would I want a life like that? Can you tell me what kind of existence that would be?" Larry struggled to find an appropriate response, finally settling on what seemed like the most obvious answer. "Well, Jennifer, it would be freedom." "Yeah, but freedom can be a lot worse than life in here," Jennifer countered, gesturing around the sterile visiting room. "Don't you understand? We can't undo the past. Things will never go back to how they were before that night. In fact, getting out might make everything worse. At least in here, I know what to expect each day." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with resignation and a kind of wisdom that only comes from profound loss. The woman who went to prison 2 years ago, she had a son she loved, a business she'd built from nothing, friends who respected her. That woman is dead, Mr. Garcia. I don't know who would be walking out of here. But Larry Garcia turned out to be a different kind of person than Jennifer had expected. Over the following months, he visited her more often than anyone could have anticipated, including Jennifer herself. What started as legal consultations gradually evolved into something more personal. Larry would bring books he thought she might enjoy, updates on the outside world that had nothing to do with her case, and, eventually, stories from his own life. Jennifer found herself, against all expectations, beginning to look forward to his visits. There was something in his manner, a genuine remorse for his role in her conviction, combined with a growing respect for her strength, that slowly began to chip away at the walls she had built around her heart. Meanwhile, in the world outside prison walls, Brandon was living what he considered to be his best life. He had indeed won over Alex's heart, and they had been living together for over 2 years now. Their relationship had a transactional quality that both parties seemed to understand and accept, though neither would admit it openly. When Brandon had casually mentioned the substantial sum of money sitting in his mother's bank account, money from the sale of her dispatching company, Alex's interest in their relationship had noticeably intensified. She became more attentive, more willing to overlook his flaws, and more invested in their future together. However, the fact that Brandon still couldn't access the account occasionally troubled her practical mind. "But it's not really your money, Brandon," Alex would say during their late-night conversations about their financial future. "I mean, technically, it belongs to your mother." Brandon's response was always the same mixture of rationalization and cold calculation. "Alex, please. 7 years in prison is no laughing matter. She must have changed completely by now. I haven't heard from her in so long that she might not even be alive anymore." Alex, despite her materialistic tendencies, still possessed enough conscience to feel uncomfortable with Brandon's casual dismissal of his mother's fate. "But you don't know anything for certain. You haven't even tried to find out how she's doing." "It doesn't matter anymore, Alex," Brandon would argue, his voice taking on the wheedling tone he used when trying to convince her of something he wasn't entirely sure of himself. "I know my mother. She loves me so much that she would give me all that money anyway. You'll see when this is all over." During one such conversation, Alex asked a question that made Brandon's blood run cold. "By the way, I never understood how your mother convinced you to get in the passenger seat that night. When you stormed out of the bar, you took off like a rocket toward your car. How did she end up driving?" Brandon felt sweat break out on his forehead as he scrambled for a believable explanation. She was faster than I thought. You know how mothers can be when they're determined to protect their children. She just jumped in and insisted on taking the wheel." Alex seemed to accept this explanation, and Brandon wiped the perspiration from his brow, his heart hammering in his chest. If she ever discovered the truth about that night, that he had been the one driving, that he had thrown his mother under the bus to save himself, she would leave him in an instant. That was something Brandon couldn't afford, not when he was so close to accessing his mother's money. He decided to wait a few more months before seriously pursuing the inheritance, wanting to be absolutely certain that his mother was either dead or had given up any hope of release. Brandon's opportunity came sooner than expected when he encountered Cindy outside a coffee shop downtown. His mother's former friend and business partner had been Jennifer's most trusted employee, essentially running the day-to-day operations of the dispatch company while Jennifer handled the bigger picture. Although Cindy had once held the title of vice president and had genuinely cared for Jennifer, she clearly intended to ignore Brandon and continue on her way when she spotted him. However, it was Brandon who approached her, putting on his most concerned and innocent expression. "Hey, Cindy," he called out, jogging slightly to catch up with her. "Have you heard anything from my mum lately?" Cindy stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression immediately hardening. "Why are you asking about her all of a sudden?" she asked, her voice dripping with suspicion and barely contained contempt. Brandon tried to look hurt by her tone. Well, she was supposed to be released by now, wasn't she? Her sentence should be over. "I'm just concerned because, after all, prison is a dangerous place. People can die in there." He attempted to maintain his composure, but his heart pounded in his chest as if it feared his lies might be discovered. Cindy let out a bitter laugh that contained not an ounce of humour. People die, you say? Is that what you're waiting for? Well, you can consider her dead already, and you'll never see her again in your life. Brandon felt a surge of excitement but forced his expression to remain concerned and confused. What do you mean, consider her dead? Can you explain that in simpler terms? Is she sick? Has something happened to her? Cindy stepped closer to him, her eyes blazing with years of suppressed anger. Of course I can explain it. What I'm trying to say is that you are an absolute piece of garbage and a total waste of human life. Your mother sacrificed everything for you, and you repaid her by destroying her life. She may be breathing, but the woman I knew, the woman who raised you and loved you unconditionally, she's dead because of what you did to her. With that declaration, Cindy turned and walked away, her hands shaking with rage. Her heart raced, and she barely restrained herself from saying even worse things to Brandon. But she didn't want to waste any more emotional energy on him, thinking he didn't deserve that much of her attention or anger. Meanwhile, despite Cindy's obvious hatred for him, a broad smile spread across Brandon's face. He had heard precisely what he needed to hear. His mother was essentially dead to the world, which meant he could finalize the inheritance process without any interference. Brandon genuinely believed that his mother was either gravely ill, completely broken mentally, or perhaps even physically dead. Either way, it was time to call his lawyers. Arriving home with barely contained excitement, he burst through the door of their apartment and found Alex painting her nails on the couch. "Alex, baby, pack your bags. We're going to be taking that trip abroad soon, just like I promised." Alex looked up from her manicure with interest, but also a hint of skepticism. "Really? You're not exactly early, but you're not completely late either. I was starting to get disappointed in you, to be honest. We ran out of spending money weeks ago and you haven't done anything about it." "I'm doing all I can," Brandon said, his voice full of confidence. "I met with my mother's friend today, and I think I can finally move forward with inheriting everything." Alex's eyes lit up with an almost predatory gleam. "Inheritance? Is she actually dead?" "You won't believe it, but her friend basically told me she is." Alex set down her nail polish and gave Brandon her full attention. "Brandon, there's so much money sitting in that account." "That's exactly what I'm talking about, baby. We're going to be set for life." 1 month later, Brandon's lawyer called and asked him to come to the office to discuss the inheritance. As Brandon began getting dressed in his best suit, Alex announced her intentions. "I'm coming with you, honey. I want to hear this with my own ears. I can't believe my dreams are finally coming true." Her voice was filled with barely contained excitement, the kind of anticipation that comes from years of waiting for a windfall. Brandon felt like a real man for the first time in years, someone capable of fulfilling his girlfriend's desires and living up to her expectations. He selected his best suit, a navy blue outfit he had bought for job interviews he'd never bothered to attend. Alex looked at him as he adjusted his tie and shook her head with mock disapproval. "Honey, you're so heartless. Your mother is dead and you're dressed up like you're going to a celebration or something." Brandon shrugged, not bothering to hide his indifference. "It's her own fault for getting involved in my business that night. I don't want to waste my time grieving for someone who made her own choices. I just want to enjoy the life I deserve." Alex nodded approvingly. "I suppose you're right about that. Besides, you'll have to live with the reputation of having a mother who killed an innocent pedestrian. This money is probably compensation for that embarrassment." "That's exactly right," Brandon agreed. "This inheritance is compensation for all the suffering I've had to endure because of her actions." Brandon tried to end the conversation there, feeling slightly uncomfortable with how callous they both sounded. He urged Alex to hurry, and they drove to the lawyer's office in Brandon's car, the same Honda Civic that had been the instrument of that fateful night. When they arrived at the law office, Brandon was surprised and annoyed to see Cindy sitting in the waiting area. His first thought was that his mother might have left something for this woman in her will, which would mean less money for him. However, the situation proved to be much more intriguing and devastating than he could have imagined. Brandon had expected to be handed a stack of papers to sign and a check for the inheritance, but the lawyer had different plans. Before I announce the contents of the will and discuss the inheritance, your mother specifically requested that you watch a short video message she recorded. Brandon felt a flash of annoyance. Can we skip that part? I just want to get the paperwork done and move on with my life. The lawyer shook his head firmly. Unfortunately, that's not possible. Your mother's instructions were very specific. You must view the video first, or the will cannot be executed. Everyone in the room turned their attention to the large screen mounted on the office wall. When Jennifer's face appeared, very much alive and looking healthier than she had in years, Brandon felt the blood drain from his face. "Is she alive?" he asked. His voice barely above a whisper, but no one in the room responded. In the video, Jennifer looked directly into the camera with clear, calm eyes. She was holding a baby, a beautiful little girl with dark hair and bright, alert eyes. Jennifer was smiling, really smiling, in a way Brandon hadn't seen since he was a child. "Hello, Brandon." Jennifer's voice was steady and warm, though there was an unmistakable note of finality in it. "If you're watching this, it means you've finally decided to claim what you think is rightfully yours. I want to start by wishing you happiness and success in your life. You're a grown man now, completely on your own, just as you always wanted to be." Brandon felt his hands begin to tremble as his mother continued speaking. "I know you expected to inherit the money from the sale of my company, money that I worked 20 years to accumulate, money that I earned through 18-hour days and countless sacrifices. But I have something to tell you, and I want you to hear it directly from me." Jennifer paused, her smile fading slightly as she looked directly into the camera. "Brandon, my son, you didn't want to have anything to do with me even after I served your time in prison. You never visited, never called, never even inquired about my well-being. You made it clear that you wanted me out of your life completely. So I thought to myself, if you don't want to see me, why would you want to use my money either?" The room fell silent except for the sound of Brandon's increasingly laboured breathing. "I've withdrawn everything from the account and donated most of it to organisations that help victims of vehicular accidents and their families. I thought it was appropriate given the circumstances, but don't worry. I'm not leaving you with nothing. I'm giving you a one-bedroom apartment in the city. It's small, but it's yours, free and clear. Consider it my final gift to you and my final goodbye." Jennifer's expression softened slightly as she continued. "I want you to know that I forgive you for what you did to me. I understand that you were scared and young, and you made a terrible decision in a moment of panic, but I also want you to understand that actions have consequences, and it's time for you to face yours." She held the baby a little closer and smiled again. "As for me, I've found happiness in ways I never expected. This is my daughter, Emma. She has a father who loves us both deeply, and we have a life built on truth and genuine care for one another. I wish you could find something similar, but I know that's not possible as long as you continue lying to yourself and everyone around you." Jennifer looked directly into the camera one last time. "Be honest with yourself, Brandon. Stop lying. Stop taking the easy way out, and never let down the people who care about you the way you let me down. That's the only advice I have left to give you. Goodbye, son. I hope you find peace." When the video ended, the room remained silent for several long moments. Then Brandon began to sob, not the quiet tears of grief or remorse, but the wild, desperate crying of someone whose entire world had just collapsed around him. Alex, who had been watching with growing horror and disgust, stood up without a word and stormed out of the office. She didn't spare Brandon so much as a glance, her heels clicking angrily against the marble floor as she disappeared through the door. Cindy watched Brandon's breakdown with a mixture of satisfaction and pity. She was upset with Jennifer for one reason. Even under these circumstances, her friend was still acting like a true mother by leaving something substantial for her son. The apartment Jennifer had given him was worth at least $200,000, far more than Brandon deserved after what he had done. Meanwhile, across the country in a small coastal town in California, Jennifer was sitting on a porch swing with someone who genuinely valued and loved her, Larry Garcia, who had become so much more than her attorney. During the evidence collection process that never led to a retrial, Larry had been astonished by Jennifer's capacity for forgiveness and her enormous heart. As they had worked together gathering proof of Brandon's lies and preparing to announce a retrial, Jennifer had made a decision that shocked everyone involved. She called it off. "I don't want to hurt him," she had told Larry with quiet conviction. "He's made his choices and he'll have to live with the consequences, but I won't be the instrument of his destruction, even after everything he's done to me." Larry had initially argued against this decision, believing that justice demanded Brandon face the consequences of his actions. But as he spent more time with Jennifer, he began to understand the depth of her character and the wisdom behind her choice. "Let him go," Jennifer had said during one of their final conversations about the case. "Make him accountable for his actions by removing me from his life completely. The greatest punishment I can give him is to stop being his safety net." After Jennifer's release, she and Larry met frequently. What began as a professional relationship gradually blossomed into something deeper. Larry had been through his own painful divorce. His ex-wife, also a lawyer, had cheated on him with one of her clients, and he understood the kind of betrayal that cut to the soul. Their courtship was slow and careful, built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than passion or convenience. Eventually, they grew close enough to decide to live together, and a year later, they welcomed their daughter Emma into the world. Despite everything that had transpired, the betrayal, the prison time, the loss of everything she had worked for, Jennifer felt genuinely happy and grateful for her current life. She had found something she had never expected, a partner who valued her for who she truly was, and the chance to be a mother again, this time to a child who would grow up knowing only love and honesty. She was also eternally thankful for Cindy's unwavering support and clear thinking throughout the darkest period of her life. Without Cindy's loyalty and determination to see justice done, Jennifer might never have found the strength to rebuild her life. As she watched Larry playing with baby Emma in their garden, Jennifer reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. She had lost a son, but gained a family. She had been destroyed by lies, but had found her salvation in truth. Most importantly, she had learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go. The woman who walked out of prison was indeed different from the one who had walked in. She was stronger, wiser, and free in ways that had nothing to do with physical incarceration. She had discovered that true freedom comes not from being released from external constraints, but from being honest with yourself and surrounding yourself with people who value that honesty. In the end, Jennifer's greatest victory was not in punishing Brandon for his betrayal, but in refusing to let that betrayal define the rest of her life. She had chosen hope over bitterness, love over revenge, and truth over the comfortable lies that had once bound her to a relationship that was slowly destroying them both. As for Brandon, alone in his one-bedroom apartment with nothing but his lies to keep him company, his real punishment was just beginning.